What if I told you that the most profitable trade in ancient history was made by a man who had publicly said money did not matter? That he cornered an entire market, drove his competitors to ruin, made a fortune in a single season, and then, having made his point, walked away and gave most of it back. Not because he needed the money, but to prove something that the wealthiest people in the world still do not fully understand. His name was Thales of Miletus. He lived 600 years before Christ. He is considered by many historians to be the first philosopher that the Western world ever produced. And the trade he made, the olive press monopoly of 585 BC, is the oldest recorded example of a derivatives contract in human history. By the end of this episode, you will understand exactly how he did it, why did he do it, and what it means for the way you think about knowledge, money, and the relationship between the two. To understand what Thales did and why it was so extraordinary, you first need to understand the world he was operating in. Miletus in the 6th century BC was arguably the most intellectually vibrant city in the Greek-speaking world. A port city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, it sat at the intersection of Greek culture and the great Eastern civilizations, including Lydia to the east, Egypt to the south, and Persia, which was beginning to rise beyond them. It was prosperous, cosmopolitan, and extraordinarily well connected. It was also a city that took commerce seriously. The merchants of Miletus were among the most sophisticated traders in the Mediterranean world. They understood credit. They understood futures contracts. They understood the relationship between information and commercial advantage. They were, in the language of their era, serious money, and they looked at the philosophers with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was, in their view, a luxury for people who did not need to earn a living, a pleasant entertainment for the wealthy and the idle. The philosophers talked endlessly about the nature of the universe, the foundations of knowledge, and the structure of reality. And while they talked, the merchants made money. Thales was the most prominent philosopher in Miletus, and he heard the contempt every day. The ancient sources record that he was regularly mocked for his poverty and his impracticality. The story that Aristotle preserves of Thales falling into a well while looking at the stars, too absorbed in astronomical observation to watch where he was walking, was not told admiringly. It was told as a joke. The philosopher who could not even manage to stay out of a well was hardly someone the merchants of Miletus needed to take seriously. Thales decided to answer the question once and for all. Here is the detail that most retellings of this story get wrong. Thales did not corner the olive press market through luck, through connections, or through some mysterious philosophical intuition. He did it by systematically applying genuine knowledge to a commercial problem. Thales was, among many other things, an astronomer of genuine ability. He is credited, rightly or wrongly, the historical record is uncertain, about predicting the solar eclipse of 585 BC with sufficient accuracy to astonish those who witnessed it. Whether or not this specific prediction is accurately attributed, the ancient sources consistently describe him as a systematic observer of astronomical and meteorological patterns. And those patterns, carefully observed over years, told him something that the merchants of Miletus had not noticed. The olive harvest in the ancient Mediterranean world was driven largely by climate patterns. A cold, wet winter followed by a warm, dry spring produced an exceptional harvest. Thales, studying the astronomical and meteorological data available to him, formed a judgment, probably in the winter of what we would call 586 BC, that the following year's olive harvest would be exceptionally large. An exceptionally large harvest meant an exceptionally great demand for olive presses. Olive presses, the heavy stone and wooden machinery used to crush olives into oil, were not owned by individual farmers. They were owned by specialist operators and rented out during the harvest season. In a normal year, supply roughly met demand. But in a bumper harvest year, every farmer in the region would need press time simultaneously, and the operators who owned the presses could charge whatever the market would bear. Thales saw this. He saw it before anyone else saw it, and he acted on it. During the winter months before the harvest, when no one yet knew whether the predictions would prove correct, Thales went to every olive press owner in Miletus and the surrounding region of Chios. He offered them something they found very attractive: money now, in exchange for the right to rent their presses during the coming harvest season at a pre-agreed price. The press owners were delighted. Winter was always the lean season. Cash in hand against the uncertain future of the harvest seemed like an excellent deal. They took his money without hesitation. Thales had just bought what we would now call a call option on every olive press in the region. The right, but not the obligation, to rent those presses at a fixed price, during a season when, if his prediction was correct, demand would far exceed supply. The harvest came. It was, as he had predicted, exceptional. Every farmer in the region needed press time immediately. The press owners were already contracted to Thales. He controlled every press, and he rented them out at whatever rate the market, desperate and time-sensitive, would pay. He made an enormous amount of money. The exact figure does not survive in the historical record, but Aristotle, writing about it 2 centuries later, describes it as a fortune. Significant enough that the merchants of Miletus, the people who had mocked him for his poverty, were forced to acknowledge what had happened. He showed the world, not argued to the world, showed. The oldest recorded derivatives trade in history was made not by a merchant, but by a philosopher, because genuine knowledge, rigorously applied, is a more powerful commercial weapon than commercial instinct alone. Thales did not beat the merchants at their own game. He played a different game entirely, one they did not know existed. Here is the part of the story that separates Thales from every trader who has ever come after him. He gave most of it away. Not because he was indifferent to money, in the way that a man who has never had it can perform indifference. But the point of the trade was never the money. The point was the proof. He had set out to demonstrate something specific: that philosophical knowledge, rigorously applied, was commercially superior to commercial instinct operating without it. He had demonstrated it. The demonstration was complete. The money was the evidence, not the goal. He retained enough to support his philosophical work and his students. He distributed the rest. And he returned to the thing that had generated the trade in the first place: the systematic observation of the natural world, the development of ideas, the intellectual work that the merchants of Miletus had called useless. That decision, to make the money, prove the point, and walk away from the accumulation, is one of the most financially sophisticated acts in ancient history. Not because it demonstrates noble poverty, but because it demonstrates something much rarer: clarity about what money is for. Thales' life makes visible a distinction that most people spend their entire financial lives never examining directly. There are 3 fundamentally different relationships a person can have with money, and most of us inherit one without ever choosing it. The first relationship is money as identity, the person who defines themselves by what they earn, what they own, and what they can afford to display. For this person, wealth is not a tool, it is the measure of their worth. The accumulation never stops because the finish line is always moving. More is always necessary because the underlying need to feel significant, to feel validated, to feel enough, is never satisfied by any amount. The second relationship is money as a form of security. The person who accumulates not from vanity, but from fear. Enough is never quite enough, because the fear driving the accumulation is not connected to a specific number. It is connected to a feeling of precariousness that more money reliably reduces, but never eliminates. This relationship produces better financial outcomes than the first, but a similar quality of anxiety. The third relationship is money as a tool. The person who understands precisely what they need money to do in their life, what freedom it enables, what constraints it removes, what capacities it creates, and who accumulates purposefully toward that specific function, and stops when the function is served. Thales lived in the third relationship with unusual clarity. He needed money to support his intellectual work and his students. He needed freedom from the contempt of the merchants, who used his poverty as evidence that philosophy was worthless. He needed nothing else from wealth. When the trade gave him what he needed, the proof, the freedom, enough to continue his work, he stopped. The end and beginning of his life. Not the peak and the decline. The end and the beginning. The purpose and the origin. The values that drove him and the outcome he was trying to achieve. The person who knows how to hold those two things in relation has, in Thales's view, solved the central problem of financial life. The olive press trade was not primarily a financial insight. It was a scientific one. The application of astronomical and meteorological knowledge to agricultural conditions. Thales saw what the merchants did not see, because he was looking at different data through a different framework, asking different questions. This is the specific mechanism by which wisdom generates commercial advantage, and it is worth being precise about it, because most people who talk about the relationship between knowledge and wealth are vague in practically useless ways. Wisdom generates commercial advantage through three specific mechanisms. First, pattern recognition across domains. Thales connected astronomical observation to agricultural prediction to commercial opportunity, three domains that no one in his world had ever connected. The merchant saw only the commercial domain. Thales saw all three simultaneously and understood how they related. Second, longer time horizons. Thales made his move in winter, when the harvest was months away and the outcome uncertain. The merchants, operating on commercial instinct alone, were thinking about the current season. Thales was thinking about the relationship between this winter's climate and next autumn's harvest. The wisdom to think further ahead than your competition is always commercially valuable. Third, the ability to see what is not yet visible. The merchants of Miletus could see the current market. Thales could see the future market, not through mysticism, but through the systematic application of knowledge about how the world worked. That ability to see a market that does not yet exist and position yourself within it before anyone else has noticed is the foundation of every genuinely great investment in history. Money as identity never satisfies. Money as security never reaches enough. Money, used as a tool with precision and purpose, is the only relationship with wealth that delivers on its promises. Know what you need money to do. Build toward that. Stop when it is done. Everything beyond that point is a different kind of poverty. The olive press trade of 585 BC contains, in compressed form, the central insight of every genuinely successful investment philosophy ever developed. The market prices what it knows. The edge belongs to the person who knows something the market does not. Thales knew the harvest would be exceptional. The market, the press owners, the farmers, and the merchants did not. That information asymmetry, created entirely by his superior knowledge of meteorological and agricultural patterns, was the source of his commercial advantage. He did not beat the market through luck. He beat it through knowing more than the market about something the market needed to know. This insight was formalized 2,000 years later by Benjamin Graham and expanded by Warren Buffett into the modern framework of value investing. But Thales got there first, and he got there not through financial theory, but through the application of philosophical rigor to commercial questions. The same intellectual discipline he applied to astronomy and mathematics, and the study of water as the fundamental substance of the universe. The mechanism has not changed in 26 centuries. The market prices what it knows. Your edge in investing, in your career, in any competitive domain where outcomes are determined by judgment rather than luck, is always and only the gap between what you know and what the market knows. First, in your career. Every person has a domain where their knowledge is genuinely deeper than the market's. The problem is that most people undervalue that depth because they are surrounded by others in the same field with similar knowledge. The edge is visible not from inside the domain, but from outside it, when that knowledge is applied to problems that the domain's usual inhabitants are not solving. Thales' edge was not that he knew more astronomy than other astronomers. It was that he was the only person connecting astronomical knowledge to agricultural prediction, to commercial positioning. The intersection of domains is almost always where the real knowledge edge lives, because most people stay inside their domain and never look at what it connects to. Second, in investing. The retail investor who tries to compete with institutional investors on their own terms, analyzing the same companies, reading the same reports, using the same frameworks, is playing a game they cannot win. The information advantage belongs to the professionals, but the retail investor has something the professional does not: a longer time horizon and no obligation to report quarterly performance. That time horizon asymmetry is a genuine knowledge edge. The investor who understands that a company is building something whose value will only be apparent in 10 years and who can hold for 10 years while the institutional investors churn quarterly, is operating in the Thalesian tradition and seeing the future market before the current market does. Third, in building genuine expertise. Thales' olive press trade was only possible because he had spent years developing deep knowledge in a domain that seemed commercially irrelevant. Nobody watching him study the stars in 590 BC could have predicted that this knowledge would produce a fortune in 585 BC. The connection was invisible until it became obvious. The knowledge you build today, in domains that seem impractical, in intersections that do not yet exist, in questions that nobody around you thinks to ask, is the olive press option of your financial future. Its value is not visible now. That is precisely why it is valuable. The market prices what it knows. Your edge is always the gap between what you know and what the market knows. Build knowledge at the intersections of domains. Extend your time horizon beyond the markets. Ask the questions nobody around you is asking. The Thales trade was not clever. It was the inevitable result of knowing more, for longer, about something that mattered commercially. Thales is remembered for the olive press trade. It is the story that survived because it makes the point most dramatically. The impractical philosopher, who turned out to be more commercially capable than all the practical merchants combined. He taught Anaximander, who taught Anaximenes. His intellectual tradition shaped Pythagoras. It reached Plato. Through Plato, it reached Aristotle. Through Aristotle, it shaped the entire intellectual framework of the Western world. The olive press trade made him a fortune for one season. The intellectual tradition he founded has been generating returns for 26 centuries. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is the precise measure of the difference between wealth generated by a single clever trade and wealth generated by genuine, enduring intellectual contribution. Thales understood this. That is why he walked away from the accumulation. The trade was proof. The work was the point. In the fragments of Thales' thought that survive, through Aristotle, through Diogenes Laertius, through later commentators, a coherent financial philosophy emerges. Not a set of investment rules, a set of principles about the relationship between wisdom and wealth that are, if anything, more relevant in the information economy of the 21st century than they were in the agricultural economy of ancient Ionia. The first principle. Knowledge is the most leverageable asset. A piece of land produces what it produces. A skill produces what it produces. But knowledge, specifically, knowledge that sees connections others do not see, that extends time horizons others cannot extend, that asks questions others have not thought to ask, produces returns that are not limited by the linear relationship between input and output that governs every other asset class. The second principle. The point of commercial success is freedom, not accumulation. Thales did not need a large fortune. He needed enough to continue his work without the contempt of people who measured worth in commercial terms. Once he had that, once the point was proved and the freedom was secured, accumulation was irrelevant. The person who confuses the freedom that money buys with the money itself will accumulate indefinitely toward a destination that does not exist. The third principle. The most valuable questions are the ones nobody is asking. Every great commercial opportunity in history has been located at the intersection of what is genuinely knowable and what the market has not yet thought to ask. Did Thales not ask the question that every merchant in Miletus was asking? How do I get more of the current market? He asked a question nobody had thought to ask. What will the harvest look like next year? And what does that mean for the people who own the presses? Wisdom is not the opposite of commercial success. It is the deepest source of it. The person who builds genuine knowledge at the intersections of domains, who extends their time horizon beyond the markets, who asks the questions nobody else is asking. That person is not a philosopher who occasionally makes money. They are operating with the most powerful commercial advantage ever identified. Thales proved it in 585 BC. The mechanism has not changed. Let me bring this home with 3 things you can do this week. First, map your knowledge intersections. Where does your deepest expertise connect to domains that most people in your field never look at? That intersection, the place where your specific knowledge meets a problem that the usual inhabitants of that domain are not solving, is where your Thales trade lives. Write it down. Most people have never looked for it. Examine your relationship with money honestly. Is it identity, security, or a tool? If the accumulation in your life has no clear stopping point, if there is no defined enough, then you are probably in the first or second relationship, and no amount will ever deliver what you are looking for. Define what money needs to do for you, specifically, then build toward that, and know what stopping looks like. Third, start asking the questions one step ahead. In your career, in your investments, in your financial planning, what is the question that most people in your situation are not asking? What connection is available to you through your specific knowledge and experience that the market has not yet priced? That question is worth more than any specific answer you could find by asking the same questions everyone else is asking. Thales fell into a well while looking at the stars. The merchants of Miletus laughed. Then he made a fortune they could not replicate, proved the point he set out to prove, and went back to looking at the stars. The merchants are forgotten. The philosopher is not. Subscribe to Disciplined Wealth. Share this with someone who has been told that their knowledge is impractical. And tell me in the comments, what is your fails trade? I will see you in the next episode.